The morning fog hung low over the Philadelphia naval shipyard, thick and grey, like the smoke of a war that had already consumed too many young American lives. It was April 6, 1968, and in the pre-dawn darkness, a steel colossus stirred from a decade of silence. The USS New Jersey, hull number BB-62, had been sleeping in the mothball fleet since 1957. Her massive guns wrapped in protective cocoons, her decks empty of the thousands of sailors who had once called her home. But on this morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the industrial haze of Pennsylvania, the most powerful battleship ever built by the United States Navy was about to breathe again. Captain J. Edward Snyder stood on the bridge, watching as the last preparations were made for the recommissioning ceremony. He was a man who understood the weight of history, who knew that the vessel beneath his feet had earned more battle stars than any other battleship in the American fleet. World War II, Korea, and now a conflict that was tearing the nation apart from the inside out, Vietnam. The decision to reactivate the New Jersey had not been made lightly. In the corridors of the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had studied the grim statistics with increasing alarm. American aircraft were falling from the skies over North Vietnam at an unsustainable rate. Pilots were being captured, killed, or simply vanishing into the jungle below. The sophisticated surface-to-air missiles supplied by the Soviet Union had turned the air war into a deadly game of Russian roulette, and the United States was losing. On May 31, 1967, McNamara had authorized a study that would change the course of the naval war. The question was simple. Could the dormant battleships of World War II provide an alternative to the vulnerable aircraft? Could their massive guns deliver the same destructive power without risking American pilots? The answer came back within weeks. Yes, but only one ship was ready. The New Jersey had undergone an extensive overhaul just before her last decommissioning. Her boilers were sound, her turbines were intact. Her 9 16-inch guns, capable of hurling 2,700-pound shells over 23 miles, were still the most devastating naval weapons ever mounted on an American warship. While her sister ships, the Iowa, the Missouri, the Wisconsin, would require months of additional work, the New Jersey could be brought back to life in just over a year. $21 million, and 13 months later, she was ready. The recommissioning ceremony drew thousands of spectators to the Philadelphia waterfront. Politicians delivered speeches about firepower and freedom. Admirals praised the decision to bring back the battleship. But Captain Snyder's attention was elsewhere. He was watching his crew, 400 young men, most of whom had never seen combat, many of whom had never even been to sea on a vessel this size. They were about to sail into a war that had already claimed over 30,000 American lives, and they would do so aboard a ship that had been designed to fight a very different kind of enemy. The New Jersey was a relic of a bygone era, a floating fortress from a time when naval battles were decided by the thunderous exchange of heavy shells between armored giants. The Japanese battleships she had been built to destroy, the Yamato, the Musashi, had long since been sent to the bottom of the Pacific. The naval doctrine that had guided her construction had been rendered obsolete by aircraft carriers and guided missiles. And yet, here she was, being called back to duty for a war fought in rice paddies and jungle tunnels against an enemy who moved through the night like ghosts and vanished before the sun could reveal them. But the men in Washington understood something that the critics did not. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army had built their coastal defenses with impunity, knowing that American aircraft paid a heavy price for every bombing run. They had constructed bunkers of reinforced concrete, dug tunnel complexes that stretched for miles beneath the earth, established supply depots and artillery positions within range of the sea. And they had done all of this believing that the only threat from the water would come from destroyers and cruisers, ships whose 8-inch and 5-inch guns could be survived endured, rebuilt after. They had never faced 16-inch shells. As the New Jersey completed her fitting out and began her journey toward the war zone, the men aboard her could not have known that they were about to write one of the most extraordinary chapters in American naval history. They could not have known that their ship would fire more rounds in 6 months than she had in all of World War II and Korea combined. They could not have known that a single shell from their guns could clear a helicopter landing zone 200 yards across, or that the mere sound of their main battery would send enemy soldiers fleeing from positions they had held for years. All they knew, as the Philadelphia skyline disappeared behind them and the Atlantic Ocean stretched out ahead, was that they were going to war, and they were going aboard a ship that had never lost a battle. The transit took 24 days. From Philadelphia to Pearl Harbor, from Pearl Harbor to Subic Bay in the Philippines, the New Jersey cut through the Pacific at speeds that would have seemed impossible for a vessel of her size. 33 knots, faster than most destroyers, faster than any other battleship afloat. Her 4 propellers churned the water into white foam, driven by steam turbines that produced 212,000 horsepower. 887 feet of American steel, displacing 58,000 tons when fully loaded, racing toward a conflict that would test everything she had been built to do. At Subic Bay, the crew loaded 88 tons of ammunition and powder into her magazines. The shells were arranged in the handling rooms beneath each turret, ready to be hoisted up to the guns that would send them screaming toward targets 20 miles away. The powder bags, each containing 110 pounds of propellant, were stored in climate-controlled magazines to prevent the catastrophic explosions that had claimed other warships. Everything was checked, double-checked, and checked again. There would be no second chances on the gun line. On September 25, 1968, the New Jersey departed Subic Bay for the final leg of her journey. 4 days later, she arrived off the coast of South Vietnam, taking up position near the 17th parallel, the demilitarized zone that separated north from south, the invisible line that had become the most heavily defended stretch of real estate on Earth. The war was about to change. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. The story you are about to witness is one of the most powerful examples of American military might ever recorded. And it is only the beginning. Subscribe now, so you do not miss a single moment of what comes next. September 30th, 1968. The sun was just beginning to rise over the South China Sea when the order came down from the Combat Information Center. Target coordinates had been received from Marine spotters on the ground. Enemy positions had been identified near the DMZ, bunkers, supply depots, troop concentrations. The New Jersey was cleared to engage. In Turret 2, deep within the armored barbette that protected the guns from enemy fire, 77 men moved with practiced precision. The shell handlers wrestled 2,700-pound armor-piercing rounds onto the hoists. The powder men loaded the silk bags of propellant into the breeches. The gun captains checked their instruments, verified their calculations, and reported ready to the fire control director high above them in the superstructure. On the bridge, Captain Snyder gave the order that had not been spoken aboard an American battleship in over 16 years. Fire! The New Jersey shuddered as all 9 of her 16-inch guns erupted simultaneously. The blast wave rolled across the water like a physical force, flattening the swells for hundreds of yards in every direction. Inside the ship, men who had never experienced a full broadside felt their bones vibrate, felt the deck plates shift beneath their feet, felt the awesome power of 9 shells, weighing a combined 12 tons, hurling themselves toward the Vietnamese coast at nearly half a mile per second. 23 miles away, the shells struck their targets. The first bombardment destroyed a storage area, cut 2 access roads, and tore up 300 meters of trenches. An enemy artillery position was silenced. 5 bunkers were flattened. And all of this had been accomplished in less than a minute, without a single American life at risk, without a single aircraft entering the deadly envelope of North Vietnamese air defenses. The message was clear. The rules of the war had changed. Over the next several weeks, the New Jersey established a pattern of operations that would become legendary among the Marines and soldiers fighting on the ground. She would take up position along the coast, sometimes as close as 2,000 yards from the beach, and wait for the calls for fire support to come in. They always came. The American forces fighting in I Corps, the northernmost military region of South Vietnam, had never had access to firepower like this. The biggest guns they had seen were the 8-inch rifles of the cruisers, weapons that seemed puny compared to the battleship's main battery. The New Jersey's 16-inch shells were in a class by themselves. Each one contained enough explosive to create a crater 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep. Each one could penetrate 30 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. Each one could defoliate trees for 400 yards from the point of impact, turning dense jungle into a moonscape of splintered wood and churned earth. And each one arrived without warning, faster than the speed of sound, giving the enemy no chance to take cover, no opportunity to escape. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Captured Viet Cong soldiers spoke of the terror that gripped their units when the distant thunder of the battleship's guns rolled across the horizon. They knew that in the seconds that followed, death would fall from the sky with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. Marine spotters in aircraft overhead guided the fire with precision that amazed even the most experienced artillerymen. A single 16-inch shell could clear a helicopter landing zone 200 yards across, creating an instant opening in jungle so thick that no other weapon could penetrate it. On October 1st, Brigadier General A.C. Gruston, commander of Vitifatif Artillery Corps, came aboard to witness the firepower firsthand. What he saw convinced him that the Navy had found the answer to problems that had plagued American forces since the beginning of the war. Enemy bunkers that had withstood repeated airstrikes were obliterated by direct hits from the main battery. Cave complexes that had sheltered Viet Cong fighters for years were sealed by the tremendous concussive force of the high-explosive shells. Supply depots that had been thought invulnerable to conventional attack were reduced to smoking rubble. The statistics began to accumulate. Structures destroyed, bunkers eliminated, roads interdicted, trench lines rendered unusable. Secondary explosions triggered as ammunition dumps and fuel stores caught fire, and through it all, the New Jersey remained virtually invulnerable to enemy counterattack. The North Vietnamese had nothing in their coastal arsenal that could seriously threaten an Iowa-class battleship. Their artillery was too light, their missiles too few, their patrol boats too fragile to challenge nearly 60,000 tons of armored steel. On October 23rd, something happened that illustrated both the enemy's desperation and the battleship's invincibility. As the New Jersey shelled targets north of the DMZ, North Vietnamese gunners attempted to strike back. Artillery position near Cap Lay opened fire on the American warship, launching 10 to 12 rounds in a futile gesture of defiance. The shells fell far short. Aerial spotters were called in to locate the enemy gun position. They found fresh tire tracks leading to a concealed area, evidence that artillery had been there but had already been moved. The New Jersey responded with 5 16-inch shells, obliterating the suspected position. In the darkness, spotters could not confirm hits, but it hardly mattered. The message had been sent. You cannot hide from us. You cannot hurt us. And when you try, we will find you and destroy you. November 1968 would bring the New Jersey's most intensive combat operations of the entire deployment. On the 25th, she launched what would become the most destructive shore bombardment of her Vietnam tour. For 2 days, the battleship concentrated her fire on Viet Cong storage areas near Quang Ngai, a coastal province that had been a stronghold of enemy activity since the early years of the war. The results were staggering. 182 structures destroyed, 54 bunkers eliminated, 93 additional structures heavily damaged, several tunnel complexes demolished, their entrances collapsed, their connecting passages filled with debris. In 48 hours, the New Jersey had accomplished what months of conventional operations had failed to achieve: the systematic destruction of an entire enemy logistics network. The Marines who witnessed these bombardments would carry the memories for the rest of their lives. They spoke of debris flying hundreds of feet into the air when the shells struck, of bunkers that had been built with logs and rocks several feet thick, simply disintegrating under the impact. They spoke of the sound, not just the explosion, but the freight train roar of the shells passing overhead, a sound that told them help was on the way, that the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal was fighting on their side. One aircraft observer reported that a bombardment had completely opened up a mountain top. The shells had carved into the Vietnamese highlands like the fist of an angry god, reshaping the terrain itself, denying the enemy the high ground from which they had launched attacks with impunity. Korean Marines fighting alongside American forces advanced against positions that would have cost them dozens of casualties to take by conventional assault, walking into areas that the battleship's guns had already cleared. But it was not just the destructive power that made the New Jersey so effective. It was the accuracy. The ship's fire control systems, upgraded during her reactivation, could calculate trajectories with a precision that bordered on the miraculous. Spotters would call in coordinates, and within minutes shells would be landing exactly where they were needed. Not yards away, not in the general vicinity, but directly on target. This was a weapon that could be used in close support of friendly troops, a weapon that could strike enemy positions within hundreds of yards of American lines without fear of friendly fire incidents. The gun crews worked around the clock, their rhythm never faltering. Load, aim, fire, repeat. Each shell that left the barrels was a message written in steel and high explosive, a statement of American resolve that no enemy bunker could withstand. The powder men breathed the acrid smoke of burnt propellant. The shell handlers nursed muscles that ached from wrestling rounds that weighed more than a compact car. The fire control technicians stared at their screens until their eyes burned, tracking targets, calculating solutions, ensuring that every shot counted. And above them all, on the bridge and in the Combat Information Center, the officers coordinated the deadly ballet. They received the calls for fire support, prioritized targets, allocated ammunition, and made the decisions that determined where the thunder would fall next. It was exhausting work, demanding work, work that required absolute concentration and unfailing precision. A miscalculation could mean shells falling on friendly troops. A moment of inattention could mean missed opportunities, enemy soldiers escaping to fight another day. But the men of the New Jersey did not falter. They had been given a mission, and they would see it through. The ship that had helped win World War II, that had bombarded the coasts of Korea, was now proving that battleships still had a role to play in modern warfare. The critics who had dismissed the recommissioning as a waste of money, who had called the Iowa-class ships obsolete relics of a bygone age, were being proven wrong with every salvo fired. The war in Vietnam would continue for years after the New Jersey departed. The outcome would be determined by factors far beyond the reach of any ship's guns: political will, public opinion, the determination of an enemy who measured victory in decades rather than months. But for the Marines and soldiers who fought in the Corps in the fall and winter of 1968, the battleship's presence made a difference that could be measured in lives saved, in battles won, in positions taken that would otherwise have been abandoned to the enemy. The deadliest ship in the American fleet had arrived, and for those who faced her guns, there was nowhere to hide. The observation post, called Ocean View, sat on a narrow strip of coastal sand, isolated and exposed, about 10 kilometers north of the Cua Viet River. It was one of the most vulnerable American positions in all of South Vietnam. A Marine Anglico station tasked with directing naval gunfire against enemy artillery that threatened the supply lines running up from the coast. The 32 Marines stationed there, along with 11 Army crewmen manning 2 M42 Duster anti-aircraft vehicles, knew that they were living on borrowed time. The enemy knew where they were, the enemy knew how few of them there were, and the enemy was coming. February 22nd, 1969. The night was black and moonless when the first mortar rounds began falling on the perimeter. Within minutes, it became clear that this was not a probing attack, not a harassment action designed to disrupt sleep and erode morale. This was an all-out assault by an estimated 500 North Vietnamese regulars, soldiers who had been moving through the DMZ for days, gathering for a strike that was meant to wipe Ocean View off the map. The Marines responded with everything they had. The Dusters opened up with their twin 40mm guns, sweeping the approaches with fire that cut down the first wave of attackers. Rifle fire crackled from the fighting positions. Claymore mines detonated in the wire, sending thousands of steel balls screaming into the darkness. But the enemy kept coming, wave after wave, accepting losses that would have broken a lesser force, pressing forward with the kind of suicidal determination that had characterized North Vietnamese tactics throughout the war. By midnight, the situation was desperate. The Marines were running low on ammunition. Several of their positions had been overrun. Casualties were mounting. And still, the enemy pressed the attack, sensing that victory was within reach, that the hated American observation post would be destroyed before dawn. 20 miles offshore, the USS New Jersey received an urgent request for fire support. In the Combat Information Center, officers studied the coordinates with grim determination. The Marines at Ocean View needed help immediately, not in an hour, not in 30 minutes, but now. The battleship's guns could provide that help, but the margin for error was razor-thin. Fire too close to friendly positions and the massive shells would kill the very men they were trying to save. Fire too far away and the enemy assault would continue unabated. Captain Snyder made the call. The New Jersey would engage. What followed was one of the most remarkable feats of naval gunnery in the history of the Vietnam War. For 6 hours, through the darkest part of the night, the battleship's guns roared continuously. The fire control teams worked with surgical precision, adjusting their aim as the Marines on the ground called in corrections. Shells that weighed more than a ton fell within yards of American positions, close enough to shower the defenders with dirt and debris, but not close enough to harm them. The enemy formations that had seemed unstoppable were shattered by the impacts, their attacks broken up before they could reach the wire. The ground shook with each salvo. The night sky lit up with the flash of detonations. The North Vietnamese soldiers, who had expected to overwhelm a small garrison with superior numbers, found themselves facing firepower that no amount of courage could overcome. The massive shells did not distinguish between officers and enlisted men, between veterans and raw recruits. They simply destroyed everything in their path, tearing apart bodies and equipment with equal indifference. By dawn, the attack had been broken. The Marines at Ocean View, many of whom had resigned themselves to death during the darkest hours of the night, emerged from their fighting holes to survey a landscape that had been transformed by the battleship's guns. Craters pockmarked the approaches to their position. Enemy bodies lay scattered across the sand, victims of the shells that had fallen among them with such devastating accuracy. Equipment and weapons lay abandoned where their owners had dropped them in the desperate flight from the killing ground. The New Jersey had saved Ocean View. There was no other way to describe it. Without the battleship's intervention, the observation post would have been overrun. its defenders killed or captured, its equipment destroyed. The enemy had committed 500 troops to the assault, more than 10 times the number of Americans defending the position. Under normal circumstances, such odds would have been insurmountable. But there was nothing normal about having an Iowa-class battleship on call. If this story is touching you, if you feel the weight of what these men experienced, leave a comment now saying, "The thunder saved them." Let the world know that you understand what sacrifice and firepower mean when they come together in the darkest hour. The action at Ocean View became legendary among the Marines who served in I Corps. It was proof that naval gunfire support could make the difference between life and death, that the ancient partnership between ground forces and the ships that supported them still held meaning in the age of helicopters and jet aircraft. The New Jersey had demonstrated that she was more than a floating artillery platform. She was a guardian angel for the men fighting on the ground, a protector who could reach across miles of ocean and jungle to deliver salvation in the form of 2,000-pound shells. But Ocean View was just one night in a deployment that stretched for months. The New Jersey continued her patrols along the Vietnamese coast, answering calls for fire support from units scattered across the I Corps tactical zone. She supported the 1st Marine Division and the 3rd Marine Division. She fired in support of the 173rd Airborne Brigade and the 101st Airborne Division. She provided cover for South Korean Marines fighting alongside American forces. And she participated in Operation Sea Dragon, the Navy's effort to interdict North Vietnamese supply shipments along the coast. The statistics accumulated with each passing week. By the end of her deployment, the New Jersey would have fired 5,688 rounds from her 16-inch guns and 14,191 rounds from her 5-inch secondary battery. This was more ammunition than the ship had expended in all of World War II and Korea combined, a staggering testament to the intensity of her operations and the demand for her services. The main battery alone was credited with destroying 439 structures and damaging 259 more. 596 bunkers were eliminated. 250 more were damaged. 19 artillery sites were neutralized. 35 automatic weapons, anti-aircraft, and mortar positions were silenced. 130 secondary explosions were triggered as the shells found ammunition stores and fuel depots. 26 roads were interdicted, their surfaces cratered to the point of impassability. 1,925 meters of trench line were rendered unusable. 75 cave and tunnel complexes were destroyed, and the human cost to the enemy, 136 killed in action, confirmed by ground observation, 17 more probable kills. 12 troop movements stopped before they could develop into attacks. These numbers tell only part of the story. They cannot capture the terror that gripped enemy soldiers when they heard the distant thunder of the battleship's guns. They cannot convey the relief that washed over American infantrymen when they learned that the New Jersey was on station, ready to answer their calls for help. They cannot express the pride that the ship's crew felt as they went about their work, knowing that every shell they loaded, every calculation they made, every order they followed was contributing to the survival of their countrymen on the ground. The men of the New Jersey were not infantrymen. They did not patrol through hostile jungle, did not engage the enemy at close quarters, did not face the constant threat of ambush and booby trap that characterized ground combat in Vietnam. Their war was fought from the relative safety of an armored warship, surrounded by thousands of tons of steel, protected by weapon systems that could destroy any threat the enemy might bring against them. But they were warriors, nonetheless. They worked 18-hour shifts in conditions that would have broken lesser men. They breathed the smoke of burning propellant until their lungs ached. They handled shells and powder bags that could kill them in an instant if something went wrong. They lived with the constant knowledge that their work meant life or death for Americans they would never meet, soldiers and Marines who were counting on them to deliver the firepower that would keep them alive. And they never failed. Not once. Not a single call for fire support went unanswered during the New Jersey's Vietnam deployment. Not a single friendly position was lost because the battleship could not provide the support it had been asked to give. The ship that had been called obsolete, that had been dismissed as a relic of a bygone age, had proven that she still had a vital role to play in America's wars. The critics would continue to question the decision to reactivate the battleship. They would point to the cost, $21 million for the recommissioning, plus the daily expense of keeping such a massive vessel in operation. They would argue that the same firepower could have been delivered more efficiently by aircraft or cruise missiles. They would claim that the New Jersey's success was an anomaly, a product of unique circumstances that could not be replicated. But the Marines who had been saved at Ocean View knew better. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne, who had advanced against enemy positions that the battleship's guns had pulverized, knew better. The pilots who had been spared dangerous missions over heavily defended coastal areas knew better. For them, the New Jersey was not a relic or an anomaly. She was a lifesaver, a war winner, a symbol of American power that had made a tangible difference in the most important way possible. She had kept them alive, deep in the bowels of the USS New Jersey, in the powder magazines and shell handling rooms that formed the beating heart of her destructive power. A different kind of war was being fought. It was a war of logistics, of mathematics, of the constant struggle to keep the ship's guns fed with the ammunition they consumed at a rate that would have seemed impossible to the naval architects who had designed her. Each 16-inch shell weighed 2,700 pounds for the armor-piercing variant, 1,900 pounds for the high-capacity explosive rounds that were used for most shore bombardment missions. Each required 6 silk bags of propellant to send it screaming toward its target at nearly half a mile per second. Each had to be hoisted from the magazines, loaded into the gun, and fired with split-second timing that left no room for error. The men who performed this work were the unsung heroes of the New Jersey's Vietnam deployment. They did not stand on the bridge, did not make the decisions that determined where the shells would fall, did not receive the glory that came with direct engagement of the enemy. They worked in the hot, cramped spaces below decks, muscling rounds that weighed more than most automobiles, breathing air thick with the smell of oil and cordite, performing the backbreaking labor that made everything else possible. A turret crew consisted of 77 men, each with a specific role in the complex choreography of loading and firing the guns. The shell handlers in the magazine worked in teams, wrestling the massive projectiles onto the hoists that would carry them up to the gun rooms. The powder men moved the propellant charges with careful precision, knowing that a single spark could trigger a catastrophic explosion. The rammermen shoved the shells into the breeches with hydraulic arms. The gun captains coordinated every movement, ensuring that the deadly ballet proceeded without a single misstep. During intensive bombardment operations, a single turret could fire 2 rounds per minute from each of its 3 guns. That meant 6 rounds per minute per turret, 18 rounds per minute from the main battery as a whole. Each round represented tons of steel and explosive hurling toward the enemy, a cascade of destruction that had to be sustained for hours at a time. The logistics of maintaining such a rate of fire were staggering. The New Jersey had departed for Vietnam with her magazines fully loaded, carrying enough ammunition for extended combat operations. But the intensity of her employment far exceeded what had been anticipated. The calls for fire support came in constantly, from Marines pinned down by enemy fire, from Army units facing fortified positions, from spotter aircraft that had identified targets of opportunity. And every call had to be answered. Replenishment became a critical operation. At regular intervals, the New Jersey would withdraw from the gun line to rendezvous with ammunition ships, taking on fresh supplies of shells and powder to replace what had been expended. These underway replenishments were complex evolutions, requiring the battleship to steam alongside the supply vessel while tons of explosives were transferred across the churning water between them. One mistake, a broken cable, a wave at the wrong moment, a moment of inattention, could result in disaster. But the crews performed these operations with the same professionalism they brought to everything else. The New Jersey's sailors had been trained for exactly this kind of sustained combat, and they rose to the challenge. Supply officers tracked ammunition expenditure with obsessive precision. Engineers kept the ship's machinery running at peak efficiency. Medical personnel treated the inevitable injuries, sprains, strains, burns, and worse, that came with months of continuous operations. The ship herself proved remarkably resilient. Designed in the late 1930s, built during the desperate early years of World War II, she had been engineered to survive the punishment of surface battles against enemy battleships. Her armor could withstand hits from 16-inch shells at ranges that would have been suicidal for any other vessel. Her internal subdivision, with hundreds of watertight compartments, made her virtually unsinkable by any weapon the North Vietnamese possessed. This invulnerability was not theoretical. On multiple occasions during her Vietnam deployment, the New Jersey came under fire from enemy coastal batteries. The shells fell short, splashing harmlessly into the sea hundreds of yards from the ship's hull. The gunners who had fired them, probably veterans of earlier engagements against American destroyers and cruisers, had no conception of the range and accuracy of battleship fire. They learned quickly. The New Jersey's response was always the same, a devastating barrage that obliterated the offending gun position and served as a warning to anyone else who might consider taking a shot at the most powerful warship afloat. The mathematics of the New Jersey's firepower were simple but overwhelming. A single 16-inch shell could create a crater 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep. A single shell could penetrate 30 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. A single shell could defoliate 400 yards of jungle, stripping the leaves from trees and the cover from enemy soldiers. And the ship could deliver 9 of these shells simultaneously, a broadside that weighed nearly 12 tons and traveled so fast that its victims never heard it coming. Against this kind of firepower, the enemy's defenses were meaningless. Bunkers that had been built to withstand airstrikes were demolished. Tunnel complexes that had sheltered fighters for years were collapsed. Artillery positions that had harassed American forces with impunity were silenced. The New Jersey did not just attack the enemy, she reshaped the battlefield itself, creating a new geography of destruction that favored American forces. The crew understood the weight of their responsibility. Every shell they loaded was a potential lifesaver for someone fighting on the ground. Every round that left the barrels was a message to the enemy that their defenses could not protect them, that their bunkers and tunnels and fortifications were nothing against the fury of American naval power. They worked through exhaustion, through injury, through the mental strain of knowing that their performance meant life or death for men they would never meet. Captain Snyder drove them hard, but he also took care of them. Liberty calls in Subic Bay and Singapore gave the crew a chance to decompress, to remember that there was a world beyond the gun line. Mail from home provided emotional sustenance, religious services offered spiritual comfort, and the certain knowledge that they were making a difference, that their work was saving American lives, provided a motivation that no amount of fatigue could extinguish. By the time the New Jersey completed her Vietnam deployment, she had expended nearly 12 million pounds of ordnance. Her main battery alone had fired more rounds than in all her previous wars combined. The barrels of her guns showed the wear of continuous use, the chrome plating that extended their service life beginning to erode under the tremendous heat and pressure of repeated firing. But the ship had proven something that many had thought impossible. She had demonstrated that battleship firepower still had a role to play in modern warfare. She had shown that there were some problems that only massive guns could solve, some targets that only 2,000-pound shells could destroy, some situations where nothing less than the thunder of 16-inch rifles would suffice. The New Jersey had been designed to fight other battleships, to engage in the kind of surface warfare that had defined naval combat for centuries. Instead, she had spent her Vietnam tour supporting ground troops, interdicting supply lines, destroying enemy fortifications. It was not the war she had been built for, but it was the war she had been given, and she had fought it with a fury that her enemies would never forget. April 1st, 1969. The USS New Jersey fired her last rounds in Vietnamese waters and turned her bow toward Japan. Behind her, she left a coastline transformed by months of bombardment, a landscape scarred by the craters of her shells, an enemy that had learned to fear the distant thunder that preceded death from the sea. Ahead lay an uncertain future, a future that would see the great battleship returned once again to the mothball fleet, her guns silenced, her decks emptied of the men who had served her so well. The crew did not know it yet, but their ship's Vietnam service was about to be cut short by forces far beyond their control. Even as they steamed toward Yokosuka for a brief port call, decisions were being made in Washington that would seal the New Jersey's fate. The war was becoming increasingly unpopular at home. The Nixon administration was looking for ways to reduce military spending, and the cost of keeping an Iowa-class battleship in operation, the fuel, the ammunition, the maintenance, the personnel, was becoming harder and harder to justify. The official explanation would cite economic considerations, the need to allocate resources more efficiently, the availability of alternative weapon systems that could perform the same missions at lower cost. But the men of the New Jersey knew the real reason. The war in Vietnam was not being won. The American public had turned against the conflict, and the battleship, for all her destructive power, could not change the fundamental strategic equation that made victory impossible. On April 15th, while the New Jersey was still at sea on her way back to Japan, North Korean fighters shot down an unarmed American reconnaissance aircraft over the Sea of Japan. The crisis that followed brought the battleship racing back toward the Korean peninsula, her crew preparing for a confrontation that could have escalated into a second Korean War. For several tense days, the New Jersey cruised in readiness, her guns loaded, her crew at battle stations, waiting for orders that fortunately never came. The crisis passed. The New Jersey returned to Long Beach in May, expecting to begin preparations for a second Vietnam deployment. Instead, she received orders that would keep her in port for the foreseeable future. The Navy had decided to reduce its heavy bombardment forces in Southeast Asia. The battleship services were no longer required. In December 1969, the USS New Jersey was decommissioned for the third time in her career. Her crew dispersed to other assignments. Her guns were sealed against the elements. Her engineering plant was shut down, the boilers that had driven her across 2 oceans falling cold and silent. The ship that had terrorized enemy soldiers from Tokyo to Hanoi, that had supported American forces in 3 wars, that had earned more battle stars than any other battleship in the fleet, was once again relegated to the reserve fleet. She would sit in mothballs for 13 years. For the men who had served aboard her during the Vietnam deployment, the decommissioning was a bittersweet moment. They had accomplished something remarkable: the successful combat employment of what many had considered an obsolete weapon system. They had proven that battleship firepower could make a difference in a war that seemed to have no good options, that the massive guns of the Iowa class could save lives and destroy enemies in ways that no other platform could match. But they had also witnessed the limitations of American power, the inability of even the mightiest weapons to win a war that the nation had lost the will to fight. The New Jersey had done everything that had been asked of her. She had answered every call for fire support, destroyed every target she had been given, saved countless lives through the accurate and devastating employment of her main battery. And yet the war ground on. The enemy rebuilt, and the outcome remained as uncertain as ever. The veterans of the New Jersey's Vietnam deployment scattered across the country and the world. Some remained in the Navy, continuing careers that would take them to other ships, other conflicts, other challenges. Others returned to civilian life, carrying with them memories of the gun line that would stay with them forever. The thunder of the main battery, the smell of burnt propellant, the exhaustion of 18-hour shifts, the pride of serving aboard the most powerful surface warship in the world. They told their stories to anyone who would listen. They spoke of Ocean View, where the battleship had saved a Marine outpost from destruction. They described the bombardment of Quang Ngai, where 2 days of concentrated fire had demolished an entire enemy logistics network. They remembered the calls for fire support that came in at all hours of the day and night, the rush to load the guns, the satisfaction of knowing that their shells had found their targets, and they remembered the enemy, the Viet Cong soldiers who had fled before the battleship's guns, the North Vietnamese artillerymen who had tried to return fire and watched their shells fall uselessly short. The prisoners who spoke of the terror that gripped their units when they heard the distant rumble that preceded the arrival of the massive shells. The enemy had been tough, resourceful, determined, but against the New Jersey's firepower, determination counted for nothing. The war in Vietnam would continue for another 6 years after the New Jersey departed. The outcome would be determined not by naval gunfire, but by political decisions, by the collapse of American will to continue the fight, by the resilience of an enemy who had been willing to accept casualties that would have been unthinkable to American planners. The battleship had done her part, had made her contribution, had proven that she still had value in the modern era of warfare. But she could not change the fundamental reality that the war was unwinnable under the constraints that American policy had imposed. For the Marines and soldiers who had served in the I Corps during the New Jersey's deployment, the battleship remained a symbol of what American power could accomplish when it was properly applied. They never forgot the sound of her guns, the sight of her shells impacting on enemy positions, the relief they felt when they knew she was on station and ready to support them. In a war where so much had gone wrong, where so many had died for so little apparent gain, the New Jersey had been something to believe in, a weapon that worked, a force that delivered what it promised. The ship herself rested quietly in the mothball fleet, her grey hull slowly weathering, her guns trained fore and aft in the traditional position of a vessel not at war. She had survived World War II and Korea. She had survived Vietnam. And she would survive the years of neglect that followed, waiting for the call that would bring her back to life one more time. That call would come in the 1980s, when President Ronald Reagan ordered the reactivation of all 4 Iowa-class battleships as part of his drive to build a 600-ship navy. The New Jersey would be modernized once again, fitted with Tomahawk cruise missiles and Harpoon anti-ship missiles, given new electronic warfare systems and improved habitability for her crew. She would serve off the coast of Lebanon, firing her 16-inch guns in anger for the first time since Vietnam. She would steam into the Persian Gulf, projecting American power in a region that had become increasingly vital to national interests. But that is a story for another time. For now, in the spring of 1969, the USS New Jersey was returning home from a war that would define a generation. She was carrying with her the experience of 6 months of continuous combat operations, the records of thousands of rounds fired, the gratitude of countless Americans whose lives she had helped to save. She was also carrying the ghosts of war, the memories of those who had been killed on the gun line, the weight of destruction that she had wrought, the knowledge that even the most powerful weapons could not guarantee victory when the will to win was lacking. These ghosts would sail with her for the rest of her days, reminders of what she had done and what she had failed to do, of the limits of firepower and the endurance of human conflict. The USS New Jersey sits today at a pier in Camden, New Jersey, her grey hull a monument to a century of American naval power. Visitors walk her decks, peer into her turrets, marvel at the size of her guns. They read plaques that describe her service in 4 wars, examine artifacts from campaigns that span the Pacific and beyond, imagine what it must have been like to serve aboard the most decorated battleship in American history. Among the exhibits are shell casings from the 5,688 16-inch rounds she fired during her Vietnam deployment. They stand as silent testimony to a chapter of the war that is often overlooked, a campaign fought from orchestrated, graceful story conclusion with narrative finesse. The user wants me to start wrapping up the story without doing it abruptly. They're saying the story is already long enough and we should start finalizing it. Let me continue Chapter 6 and bring it to a proper conclusion with the CTAs as requested in the original prompt. The sea that saved thousands of American lives. They represent the mathematics of destruction, nearly 12 million pounds of ordnance hurled against an enemy who had no answer to battleship firepower. The men who served aboard the New Jersey during those 6 months have grown old now. Some have passed away, their stories preserved only in the memories of those who knew them and the official records that documented their service. Others still gather at reunions, sharing tales of the gun line, of Ocean View, of the nights when the ship's guns fired continuously for hours at a time. They remember the exhaustion and the pride, the fear and the determination, the certain knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. One Marine Corps commandant would later say that the New Jersey had saved thousands of American lives during her Vietnam deployment. Another remarked that she had a tremendous psychological effect on enemy troops, that nobody ever stood up to the New Jersey. These were not empty words of praise, but honest assessments of what the battleship had accomplished, the tangible difference she had made in a war where so many efforts had ended in frustration and failure. The statistics tell part of the story. 439 structures destroyed by the main battery, 596 bunkers eliminated, 75 cave and tunnel complexes demolished, 1,925 meters of trench line rendered unusable. These numbers represent enemy positions that would never again threaten American forces, supply routes that would never again feed the Viet Cong war machine, fortifications that would never again shelter soldiers preparing to attack. But the numbers cannot capture what the New Jersey meant to the men she supported. They cannot convey the relief that flooded through a Marine pinned down by enemy fire when he heard the distant thunder of the battleship's guns. They cannot express the awe that soldiers felt when they saw the craters left by 16-inch shells, the understanding that nothing built by human hands could withstand such power. They cannot communicate the bond that formed between the sailors on the ship and the ground troops who depended on them, a bond forged in the heat of combat and tempered by shared sacrifice. The New Jersey was the only battleship to serve in the Vietnam War. She was the last of her kind to fire her guns in anger, the final expression of a naval tradition that stretched back centuries. When she departed the gun line in April 1969, an era ended, not just for the ship, but for a concept of warfare that had dominated the seas since the age of sail. The future belonged to aircraft carriers and guided missiles, to precision-guided munitions and stealth technology. The massive guns that had once decided the fate of nations would become museum pieces, objects of curiosity rather than instruments of war. The skills that the New Jersey's crew had mastered, the loading of shells, the calculation of trajectories, the coordination of fire, would pass out of living memory, preserved only in manuals and training films. But the legacy of the New Jersey's Vietnam service endures. It endures in the lives of the men who came home because a battleship was there to support them. It endures in the lessons learned about the value of naval gunfire in supporting ground operations. It endures in the proud tradition of a ship that never failed to answer the call, that never abandoned those who depended on her, that fought with honor and distinction in every conflict she entered. Today, when visitors stand beneath the massive barrels of her 16-inch guns, they are standing in the presence of history. They are touching a vessel that shaped the outcome of battles, that terrified enemies, that earned the respect of allies. They are connecting with a time when American power was measured in tons of steel and pounds of explosive, when the thunder of naval guns could change the course of a war. The USS New Jersey earned 19 battle stars across 4 wars, more than any other battleship in American history. She received a Navy Unit Commendation for her service in Vietnam, recognition of the extraordinary performance of her crew during those 6 months on the gun line. She was the ship that admirals wanted to command, that sailors were proud to serve aboard, that enemies learned to fear above all others. She was the deadliest ship that ruled the waters of the Vietnam War. And though her guns have been silent for decades, though her engines will never again drive her through the waves, though her crew has scattered to the 4 winds, her story remains. It is a story of American power and American sacrifice, of young men who answered their country's call and served with distinction in a war that divided the nation. It is a story of technology and tradition, of ancient weapons systems proving their worth in modern conflicts. It is a story of courage under fire, of professionalism in the face of danger, of a ship and her crew rising to meet every challenge placed before them. The thunder has faded, the gun smoke has cleared, the war has ended, and new conflicts have taken its place. But the legacy of the USS New Jersey lives on, in the memories of those who served, in the gratitude of those who survived, in the quiet pride of a nation that built such ships and raised such sailors. She was more than steel and machinery. She was more than guns and armor. She was the embodiment of American naval power, the last of the great battleships, the deadliest ship ever to sail into Vietnamese waters, and she will never be forgotten. If you watched this far, it's because you connected with this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. If this story moved you, if you felt the thunder of those guns and understood what those men accomplished, hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Stories like this one, stories of courage, sacrifice, and the awesome power of American military might, are what we do here. Subscribe now so you never miss another chapter of history brought to life. Until next time.